Well, thanks everybody for joining today to learn about the laws that protect the safety of bicyclists and pedestrians in the state of North Carolina. This workshop is a module that's part of a 5-part training series that we actually created in 2021, and it's been opened now this year to a broader audience. So some of this material was actually previously provided to law enforcement officers in a full day training or part of refresher courses, and now these materials are available to everyone in the Watch for Me partner communities, as well as others across North Carolina. The goal of today's class is to inform the Watch for Me partner agencies, community members, and local law enforcement officers about the laws pertaining to bicyclist and pedestrian safety, so that we all have a starting point for understanding and communicating those laws. As I mentioned, I'm Sarah O'Brien. I'm the project manager for the Watch for Me NC program, which is supported through a grant from the Governor's Highway Safety Program. And I'm a senior research associate here at the Highway Safety Research Center at UNC. We'll be getting into the material soon, but I just have a few housekeeping items to review first. So, we are on Zoom, and I do encourage you to share your camera if you're able to, because it helps us as instructors to better connect to you. But please do mute yourself. We're expecting a lot of participants to be on the call today. So if you're not directly asking a question, then do have yourself on mute. Also, I want to make sure everybody knows, you should have seen when you entered that this session is being recorded, and that's so that we can make it available to others to review after the fact. So if you're having problems with audio or connectivity, there's a few things you can try. You can call into the phone line instead of using your computer audio. You can also turn off your video camera to save bandwidth, or, as a last resort, you might need to exit and re-enter the Zoom. If you're having technical issues and you're not able to troubleshoot that, send a chat to Kristen Blank in the chat box at any time. And you can also use the same chat box for any other questions you might have for myself or my colleague who's also here, Sergeant Brian Massengel. And he's previously taught the Watch for Me law enforcement training courses for many previous years. He's a sworn officer and supervisor with the City of Durham's traffic and crash team. And he's got 19 years of experience, well, actually, I guess 20 years at this point of experience, including 2 stints with the bicycle unit. And he consults on enforcement questions that officers in the Watch for Me program might have. So just to remind you why we're here, and about the Watch for Me program for those of you who are not familiar. The Watch for Me program aims to reduce pedestrian and bicycle injuries and deaths through a comprehensive targeted approach of public education, community engagement, and leveraging specific law enforcement efforts. This year, for the program year, we welcomed 22 new community, well, not new communities, but 22 communities into the Watch for Me program. So we are offering multiple opportunities to participate and learn. This workshop is the second in a series of 5. And the workshops provide an opportunity for all the community members to learn more about pedestrian and bicyclist safety, to help bolster their knowledge and inform community participation in the Watch for Me NC program. This series can be found at our website, which is www.watchformenc.org, along with the information to register. And as a reminder, for those of you that are in a Watch for Me community, a law enforcement officer from your community is required to attend 3 out of the 5 trainings, with this module being one of them. So if you missed module 1 and you're new to Watch for Me, that module covers the basics of the program. It gives an overview of Safe Systems' approach to improving safety, and the recording is now available at our website too. If you're considering how the other modules might be relevant to you as a Watch for Me community, I want to talk quickly about that. So module 3 is the roadway design one, and that provides highlights of design principles and how a poorly designed road can contribute to the problem. It's also going to cover some of the commonly implemented treatments that are known to be effective in reducing pedestrian or bicycle crashes. So non-engineers can begin to learn a form of common language when discussing problem areas with their engineers. And this can be helpful really to all community partners, but especially to law enforcement officers who might get complaints about a location, which might actually have a problem it might be a problem that could be better solved through engineering treatments than enforcement activities. Module 4 is about crash data investigation and reporting, and that's also highly recommended as a module for law enforcement to attend, but the information shared, can be helpful to others as well. That'll go through common bicycle and pedestrian crash patterns or types, how you can use crash data to understand key behaviors, locations, or times and seasons to focus on to drive down crashes, and considerations when investigating bicycle or pedestrian crashes, and why reporting details matter when you're filling in the DMV 349 form. Did someone have a question? Okay, and then module 5 is focused on communications around bicycle and pedestrian safety, and NCDOT's purchased media plans and media framing. And we'll also share a communications toolkit that has resources and effective language that you can use. All right, so for Watch for Me partner communities, once you've met the eligibility criteria by officers participating in at least 3 of the modules, your attendance will be reported to the Governor's Highway Safety Program, and your law enforcement agency will have access to the statewide Traffic Enforcement Program reporting system, or STEP system. So you can report on eligible activities to earn credits. Your community will also be eligible to receive the Watch for Me educational materials, which a few of the examples are shown on your screen here. So with that, let's get into today's topic. The goal of the webinar today is to give communities a basic understanding of some of the state laws pertaining to pedestrian and bicyclist safety, so that you can educate, enforce, and communicate laws within your communities. Understanding the laws will enhance your ability to liaise with your community partners, communicate about the laws to the residents and various stakeholders in your community, and improve overall public understanding of the laws. In the next 2 hours, you'll take a quick poll to gauge your current understanding of the laws. We'll introduce the Watch for Me program to those of you who may be new to it, and then we'll dig into the heart of today's material, which is the laws and enforcement practices. Note that we'll take about maybe a 5 to 10 minute break towards the top of the hour, and we'll try to leave about 15 minutes at the end of the training for our post-training poll, and also for questions that you may have. Again, along the way, feel free to use the chat box to enter your questions. And Kristen, I'm going to let you monitor the chat box. So if there's something pertinent, feel free to interrupt me as we go along. Otherwise, I'll probably hold the questions until we get to some natural breaks. But Kristen, if you can help monitor that and queue up questions for me, I would appreciate it.
Sounds good, Sarah.
Okay, so for those of you not familiar with Watch for Me NC, the Highway Safety Research Center supports the local agencies in raising awareness and issues of the issues within your respective communities or agencies or organizations through partnership development and outreach with the overall goal of preventing pedestrian and bicyclist injuries and deaths by helping create this culture of safety. The Watch For Me program is not an anti-jaywalking campaign, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But based on evidence, we know that strategies that just rely on holding a one-time event or only focus on raising awareness through a media blitz or handing out flyers, that's not going to be effective at changing behavior. Watch For Me is also not a silver bullet. The program is intended to complement other efforts to improve safety for all road users. So these might sound counterintuitive to you, and if they do, I encourage you to attend the other trainings to get more familiar with the Watch for Me partner resources that are provided and learn why these strategies are not effective individually, and to help uncover the root problems that may be impacting pedestrian and bicyclist safety in your community. When Watch for Me UNC was piloted, we were able to collect some field data at crosswalks to see whether behaviors changed after those activities were conducted. And across 7 triangle crossings monitored through a driver yielding study, we saw a 27 to 32% increase in yielding from 2012 to 2015. We've also measured significant increases in knowledge of officers after going through the law enforcement training. And HSRC tracks other outcomes from the program as well, like these that are listed here from past partners. So, lessons from each community are provided in their profiles that you can read in the About link on our website. And this can also be a good resource to see, maybe what neighboring communities have done, or to look at peers with similar population sizes so you can get a sense of implementation. One aspect you'll note here is that several of these outcomes are not necessarily led by the law enforcement agency partner of a local program, but it takes the involvement of many stakeholders to move towards transformative change. To ultimately achieve transformative change, we need to push beyond reaction to the problem or set of events and move below the surface. We need to think more deeply about what causes crash events and explore underlying structures, beliefs, and values that have informed the patterns and trends that we see in communities. So crash data alone doesn't get us the full picture, and enforcement alone will never be an adequate solution. So if you didn't have a chance to attend that first module about safe systems, I encourage you to review the video for more information to help you think through this in your community. We need to recognize and acknowledge that many crash hotspots may be the reflection of a long history of valuing cars and drivers' convenience of moving through our cities over people walking or bicycling within them. And we can see this based on a couple of examples here. So, the evolution of transportation and land use planning, how the development and regulation of vehicles has evolved over time, primarily to the safety benefit of the occupant of the vehicle, and at the detriment to anyone or really anything that's outside the vehicle, kind of exemplified by the image on the right with the little boy next to the giant truck. We also need to understand that not everyone chooses to drive, or not everyone has access to a motor vehicle. So children, older people who can no longer drive, people with a disability, or people who cannot afford a car are often at a disadvantage in our existing transportation network. So you can see that with the example here where there's a school and a transit stop that you can maybe make out with a tiny sign that marks it. And clearly no sidewalk anywhere in this area. So these are just a few examples to show the inequities within transportation system in relation to people walking and bicycling. And it's important to think about and acknowledge that responsibility for road safety is not equally shared. So for instance, research shows that people of color are disproportionately represented in fatal crashes involving people walking. And this example of disparity falls along race and ethnicity, as shown on the slide here, but it can also be related to gender, age, disability status, and income. So I wanted to share these thoughts on equity before our session today because it offers some context about the road safety system and persisting inequities within the system. And state laws developed around people walking and bicycling should also be considered when thinking about inequities, specifically about how they were enacted and how they've been applied and to whom. So law enforcement officers play a critical role in reducing injuries and deaths of vulnerable road users. And this role may be most effective when focusing on those underlying issues in road safety to help with the transformative change with them. Okay, so Now we're ready to start talking about the laws that impact bicyclist and pedestrian safety in North Carolina. As we're going through the laws today, understand that you don't need to memorize the entire statute as written, but you might want to note the statute number so that you can get back to these laws quickly and easily. We'll break them down here to talk about what they mean, why they're important in terms of addressing bicyclist and pedestrian safety, educating the public about them, and what aspects might be challenging to enforce, and where there may be nuances that your community might need to discuss with your district attorney, for example, to help determine how your local agencies will interpret and apply specifics of certain laws. Law enforcement officers in the Watch For Me NC communities should be able to educate the public about these laws as well as enforce them. And being able to confidently describe the spirit of the law will help with that. Also, the broader community should have a clear and unified understanding of these laws and how or even whether to actively apply them within your community. And this will enhance your ability to work collaboratively to improve safety. So the laws that we'll focus on today are those that influence these key behaviors for safety, and they're based on crash data. The key behaviors we're seeking to improve statewide through education and enforcement include drivers yielding to pedestrians, drivers safely passing bicyclists, particularly in shared lane situations, encouraging pedestrians to use crossings, pedestrians and bicyclists being seen under dark or low light conditions, and all road users remaining attentive and looking out for each other wherever or however they may be traveling. Let's start by talking about the key laws pertaining to drivers and their responsibilities on the road with respect to pedestrians and cyclists. And we're going to start here for two main reasons. Number one, many of the laws pertaining to drivers of motor vehicles also will apply to bicyclists. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a bit. And number two, while road safety is a shared responsibility between all road users, motorists assume a greater share simply by operating a vehicle that's of greater weight, affords a higher level of protection, and that travels at a higher speed than those on foot or bicycle. You know, remember that we live predominantly in a car culture, so the deck is already stacked against people who walk or bicycle in most communities. So this General Statute 20-155, this is a statute that one of the law enforcement, or law enforcement officers, will likely enforce this one most often. So first, let's go over what the law says. It reads, the driver of any vehicle upon a highway within a business or residence district shall yield the right of way to a pedestrian crossing such highway within any clearly marked crosswalk or any regular pedestrian crossing included in the prolongation of the lateral boundary lines of the adjacent sidewalk at the end of a block, except at intersections where the movement of traffic is being regulated by traffic officers or traffic direction devices. So, what does this mean? In summary, drivers are required to yield to pedestrians at marked crossings and unmarked crosswalks at intersections, except if there's a traffic signal or an officer that's directing the traffic. North Carolina is a yield state, not a stop state, but the effect is the same, right? So drivers still need to allow pedestrians to cross, and often that does mean coming to a stop to do so. When there's a crash or if someone is hit in a crosswalk, this is the law that's cited when the driver receives a violation. So now let's walk through some of the key terms and words in the statute to break it down. In order to know how to apply this law, you need to know what is considered a crosswalk, what the prolongation of the lateral boundary lines means, and how to know when a pedestrian is within a crosswalk, right? So first, this is probably pretty obvious to you. This is a marked crosswalk. It's an example of one that's a high visibility pattern. And if there's a marked crosswalk at a location with no traffic signal, the driver must yield to pedestrians. But a marked crosswalk can come in a variety of styles. And crosswalks might be marked at an intersection or mid-block. And in fact, the crosswalk must be marked for a mid-block crossing to be a legal crosswalk. So here's two examples of an unmarked crosswalk. These are both legal pedestrian crossings because they are included in the prolongation of the lateral boundary lines of the adjacent sidewalk at the end of the block. So what does that mean? Well, if you were to draw an imaginary line from the edge of the sidewalk at one corner to the sidewalk at the other, you could effectively mark the crosswalk. So an unmarked crossing is a location where there's basically an implied crossing from the beginning of, from the end of one sidewalk to the beginning of another. Unmarked crosswalks are only going to be found at intersections, and many people are not aware that unmarked crosswalks exist as a legal thing. So if there's a problem in your community with a crossing that falls into this category, the best means of tackling that problem might be to talk to your town engineer about the possibility of installing or marking that crosswalk at that location to kind of raise that visibility. Another important detail to note within the 20-155 law is that term within. So this is referring to when the pedestrian is beginning their crossing, which is the signal for a driver that they should yield. So the picture on the left is this woman in the image, who appears to be waiting to cross the street. Is she within a crosswalk? It's important for Watch For Me communities and the relevant local law enforcement agencies to have a clear idea of what this means. So talk to your local, your legal team in advance for what it will mean for your agency. So for example, in Durham, that means that you have to have 1 foot on the blacktop. For other agencies, it may mean having a foot just on the gutter pan, or on having it off of the curb might suffice. So this distinction is important to determine and be consistent with how your local law enforcement agency will interpret the what is within, particularly when they get into conducting enforcement operations around driver yielding. So now I'm going to play a video that depicts a few different crossing scenarios. And let me see, I gotta stop sharing the screen and pull up a different screen. So hold on just a second, folks. Okay, are y'all able to see my screen here?
Yes, we can see it there.
All right, so we're just gonna go through this clip. And let me turn the volume up a little. There's going to be a few scenarios that get broken down here, different intersection types, crossing types, and we've got this, mom and kid. Here you can see it's an unmarked crosswalk, but it's at an intersection, right? They're looking, they're showing their intent to cross, stepping out. The driver sees and brakes, he yields, and then they start to proceed across. And the drivers yield near side, and then as they continue across, the drivers yield far side. And note the pedestrian is always alert and looking, and they make it safely across. Okay, in this next scenario, we've got a marked crosswalk, and you can see the pedestrian signal, so it's a signalized location, right? So in this case, they have to wait until they actually have a signal to cross. The driver gets the green, pedestrians also get the walk at the same time. They show their intent to cross, right? Because it's a left-turning vehicle, they have to yield to the pedestrian who has the right-of-way here. And then once they're through, then the driver can make the left turn. And now here's a mid-block scenario. Remember, the mid-block crossing has to be marked in order to be a legal crosswalk. Again, the pedestrian shows the intent to cross by stepping out. Driver yields. Pedestrians start to make their movement. Okay, so let me get back to the other screen. All right, so we're back on the slides. Oops, hold on. I'm trying to minimize my YouTube. Okay. Okay, so we saw a few different scenarios there, and let's talk a little bit about one of those things that we saw. So you may have noticed, I didn't point this out, but you might have noticed that there was a green vehicle that was in the second lane who stopped and didn't pass the driver that was already yielding to the pedestrians in that video. And that is relevant to this law, General Statute 20-173B, that reads, whenever a vehicle is stopped at a marked crosswalk or at any unmarked crosswalk at an intersection to permit a pedestrian to cross the roadway, the driver of any other vehicle approaching from the rear shall not overtake and pass such stopped vehicle. So this law is basically saying that the driver of the vehicle can't pass another vehicle that's stopped while they're yielding to a pedestrian that's crossing. And it doesn't matter whether it's a marked or unmarked location. So let's think about why this law is important to know when you're considering a common crash setup. So here's an example of a scenario that might lead to what we call a multi-threat crash. The pedestrian in the crosswalk is beginning to cross the street, and the bus that's in the curb lane has yielded to the pedestrian. If the driver in the car that's in that adjacent lane approaching from the rear does not stop next to the stopped bus, there could be a crash, right? Because in this sort of a scenario, the driver of the passing car, if they don't brake and yield, they might not see that pedestrian until it's really too late. So depending on the profile of the vehicle in that near lane or how far back that driver stopped from the crosswalk, it could be blocking the sight for the driver in that second vehicle or for the pedestrian to be able to look out for one another. So that's why it's known as a multi-threat crash. And these are actually, unfortunately, pretty common, and they're also very dangerous because if that second driver doesn't know and isn't yielding to slow down, it could be a higher speed crash. All right, so General Statute 20-142.5 says no driver shall enter an intersection or a marked crosswalk or drive onto any railroad grade crossing unless there is sufficient space on the other side of the intersection, crosswalk, or railroad grade crossing to accommodate the vehicle he is operating without obstructing the passage of the other vehicles, pedestrians, or railroad trains, or on-track equipment, notwithstanding the indication of any traffic control signal to proceed. What does that mean? Simply put, a driver is not allowed to pull into the crosswalk and obstruct pedestrian travel. How many of you guys have seen something like this, right? Where, a driver, maybe one who's turning right on red, and they might kind of creep up into the crosswalk so that they can get a better look, right, for gaps in traffic. We understand why they're doing that, but this behavior blocks the path of the pedestrian, so they can't do that. Here's another law pertaining to how drivers should behave when encroaching on the pedestrian space. So General Statute 20-173C says the driver of a vehicle emerging from or entering an alley, building entrance, private road, or driveway shall yield the right of way to any pedestrian or person riding a bicycle approaching on any sidewalk or walkway extending across such alley, building entrance, road, or driveway. So this law is basically saying drivers must yield to pedestrians when they're turning into and crossing the pedestrian's path along a sidewalk or walkway. So let's see what that looks like. Here's two different images that can help you visualize it. Imagine a pedestrian walking along either of these walkways, the brick one on the left, extending across a building entrance to a parking garage, probably. And the one on the right is extending across a driveway to a gas station, right? So you can kind of imagine like this is essentially the pedestrian route. It's the pedestrian area. And in that case, drivers must yield to the pedestrians when they're approaching these areas. So we just hit the highlights around driver yielding to pedestrians. This next law refers to drivers passing people on bicycles. So drivers that are overtaking and passing one another, is not new. It's a major responsibility for anyone driving. And parts A through D of General Statute 20-150 address those basics like, not crossing over the center of a highway to pass unless the left is clearly visible and free of oncoming traffic to do so safely, and not passing another vehicle on the crest of a hill or a curve where you can't see if there's safe passing distance. So, this is a common sense law that applies whether you're passing a motor vehicle or a bicyclist. Basically, just don't do it unless you have the sight and distance to do it safely. So Part E here talks about where drivers are restricted from overtaking and passing based on signage and markings. And it gives exceptions for where this restriction does not apply, which has to do with passing a slower moving vehicle that is a bicycle or a moped. So when this law was updated in 2016, it helped clarify how drivers should safely pass bicyclists, and it now allows drivers to pass them even in a no passing zone. So let's take a look. It says the prohibition in this section shall not apply when overtaking and passing is done in accordance with all of the following. The slower moving vehicle to be passed as a bicycle or a moped. The slower moving vehicle is proceeding in the same direction as the faster moving vehicle. The driver of the faster moving vehicle either provides a minimum of 4 feet between the faster moving vehicle and the slower moving vehicle, or they completely enter the left lane of the highway. And it continues on. So basically what it's saying is that a driver must either allow 4 feet of clearance to the bicyclist, or they must fully enter the left lane. So just to clarify, drivers may cross a double yellow line to pass a bicyclist as long as the left lane is clear of oncoming traffic and the driver isn't trying to pass on a curve or a hill, just as you would with any sort of passing maneuver. And as long as the bicyclist isn't attempting to turn left, right? So it's important to understand that the onus of safety here, it remains with the driver of the faster moving vehicle, right? Who is approaching and passing that slower moving vehicle. So here's an example of a driver safely passing a person on a bicycle. The driver has a clear view of the road ahead and has crossed the yellow line into the left lane so that there's plenty of space to pass. And when you look at the size of the lane, I mean, a lot of people will try to squeeze in. They maybe feel uncomfortable crossing over that yellow line, but you really need to do that to give enough space to the bicyclists. You don't want to crowd them, and there's really not enough room within that one lane to share the lane, to literally have the bicyclist and the vehicle adjacent and in that lane together. So the driver really needs to move around. Okay, now let's switch gears and look at laws that are pertaining specifically to pedestrians and pedestrian behavior. So interestingly, North Carolina doesn't define pedestrian in its general statutes, but there is a legal definition for an electric personal assistive mobility device. And I don't know if anybody knows what this definition is describing: a self-balancing non-tandem two-wheel device designed to transport one person with a propulsion system, blah, blah, blah. It's these things. It's these segways. Segway had some good lobbyists when that law was written to make sure that they could be considered a pedestrian, essentially. So, however, the law does not also define. Sorry, the law does not also define electric scooters or e-scooters. And this is something that we're looking at. So given the quick rise of shared e-scooter programs, especially in some of our more metropolitan areas, you might have these in your jurisdiction. And right now, what's typically happening is there's a local permitting process that regulates them. So you may have like a local ordinance or something. But many states have yet to formally acknowledge these vehicles by law. So depending on your community, they may or may not be allowed to be on a sidewalk. They may or may not be regulated like a pedestrian or like a bicycle. So that's something you need to be thinking about and considering. All right, going back to General Statute 20-155, let's review where a pedestrian has the right-of-way crossing the street. So they have it at marked or unmarked crossings, except at intersections where the movement of traffic is regulated by officers or a traffic direction device. Like that basically means like a signalized intersection. So if they're at a signalized intersection, pedestrians must obey the signals. So we'll talk more about following the pedestrian signal, like what's shown here on the right. But if it's a signalized intersection without a pedestrian signal, the General Statute 20-155 basically says that pedestrians should follow the traffic signal. So you'll see this concept reinforced later. In another situation where pedestrians do not have the right of way, it's crossing outside of a crosswalk. So pedestrians may cross outside of a marked or unmarked crosswalk, but in this case, the pedestrian must yield to the vehicle traffic. So I just want to be clear here, crossing mid-block is legal, but the pedestrian must yield. So you might have heard that phrase jaywalking. I mentioned that earlier. This is not a anti-jaywalking campaign. And this word was actually invented in the 1920s as a derogatory term to shame people walking when driving was becoming more prevalent, and they basically wanted to get pedestrians out of the road. So North Carolina does not have a jaywalking law. In North Carolina, crossing the street anywhere is legal as long as the pedestrian yields to the motor vehicles if they're not in a crosswalk, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about a nuance to that in a minute. So let's look at some images here. This image on the left, then, is this legal? I would argue yes. If the driver's speeds are low and the drivers are not having to change their speed or alignment of travel to avoid hitting a pedestrian, then these ladies have the right to cross here in the rain while they're yielding to the vehicles. Now, when we look at the ladies on the right, I don't know. They maybe are darting out a bit here. It's not, clear from this static image, and we don't know if the driver maybe is already slowing down due to a yield or a stop sign up ahead, and maybe the ladies are taking advantage of that. If the driver must take evasive action, then the pedestrians did not yield to the driver. So that's kind of the rule of thumb, right? To think about, did the pedestrian yield or not? All right, so the only time pedestrians cannot cross a street outside of a crosswalk, whether it's marked or unmarked, is between two adjacent signalized intersections. So that's based on General Statute 20-174. And in this case, The traffic control device at each of those intersections is assigning the right-of-way for both the vehicles and the pedestrians. This is the only constraint on the pedestrian right to cross. So you can see in this diagram, the middle diagram, if you're crossing in between a signalized intersection and a stop controlled intersection, that's fine, you're fine, as long as you're yielding to the motorists before you cross. In the graphic on the right, that block is broken up by a T intersection. So we have two signalized intersections, but then we have another intersection in between that's stop controlled, right? So again, therefore, the pedestrian can cross as long as they yield the right of way to the vehicles. Now, note that the law is silent on what a realistic scale is for this distance between the two signalized intersections. Should we expect pedestrians to walk 100, 300, 1,000 feet out of the way just to cross at a signalized intersection? You know, maybe, but maybe not. If you're in a more suburban or rural context where the intersections are more widely spaced out, or you know, you could have a situation where technically there's no other unsignalized crossing breaking up that segment between the two signalized intersections. But, you know, do I think that's a reasonable place to enforce this specific law? You know, probably not, but you need to consider the context in relation to the spirit of the law. You know, knowledge of this law is likely more important to understand in order to correctly educate the public on it. And when you're investigating a crash that may occur at a location like this. And it's more likely going to be in an urban area, right, than it is for proactively enforcing this law. So if there's a location in your community where people are crossing mid-block, and it's a consistent concern, this could be another opportunity to prevent future harm, you know, considering installing a high visibility crosswalk to clearly delineate where in that segment maybe you want people to be able to cross mid-block. Okay, General Statute 20-172 specifically explains how to use pedestrian signals. If a pedestrian has the walk sign, they have the right of way. This is important when we think back to that video where we saw the left turning vehicle that may also have the permissive green signal. So while the traffic signal and the pedestrian signal are showing that concurrent assignments of allowable movements, the pedestrian walk always trumps the driver's green ball left. When a pedestrian is crossing at a signalized intersection, then it's not legal to begin the crossing when the don't walk signal is showing. And it doesn't matter if it's flashing or steady, you can't begin the crossing if the don't walk is showing. If the flashing don't walk or countdown signal allows time for any pedestrians that are currently crossing, then they can finish during that flashing don't walk. So, and remember, you know, what we talked about, that in locations where there's no pedestrian signals, the pedestrian is subject to the lights that control the vehicular traffic. So that's what this subsection C of General Statute 20-172 is saying here, that you need to use the traffic signals if there's no pedestrian signals. Okay, so here's a visual. This group of pedestrians are beginning to cross the road, and I don't know if you can see it, it's kind of far away, but they do have a walk sign there. So they're crossing on the walk. I hope this little boy makes it across because he's clearly not paying attention, but you know, hopefully somebody in that group calls him and he turns around. All right, how many of you were taught where to walk when you were a kid? You know, here's the law that instructs safe behavior for pedestrians walking along a road. General Statute 20-174 basically says pedestrians must use a sidewalk when a sidewalk is present. You know, so in other words, don't walk in the road or along a shoulder if there's a sidewalk available. When no sidewalk is present, the law states that a pedestrian must walk facing traffic on the extreme left of the roadway or its shoulder. This may not be something that law enforcement will need to address in most cases, but it's important to know in relation to investigating a crash. It's also important to understand the emphasis here on the extreme left, and that the pedestrian should not be walking in the travel lane when they're facing oncoming traffic, if at all possible. But also note there's a term there that says when practicable, right? So that leaves some room for interpretation. So here's an example of a situation where an officer might need to make that judgment call. In this image, the two women are walking as far to the right as practicable. So we look at the environment. There's no shoulder or edge to this road, and there's a ditch that's immediately to their left. So they're walking in the travel lane facing traffic. I would argue that this is legal. Think back to that iceberg I showed at the beginning, and remember that, we need to think about the underlying system that supports the patterns that we see. So if there's places in your community that don't have sidewalks, people are going to walk in the road, and you have to consider, is enforcement really the most effective way to improve safety in a location like this? Okay, lastly, railroad crossings. Rail crashes with pedestrians are not uncommon, unfortunately. In fact, Greensboro, North Carolina is actually a national hotspot for pedestrian train crashes. Most railroads in North Carolina are privately owned, and their property are not in the public right-of-way. So it's actually considered trespassing to walk on their property. And that's why this general statute is actually in chapter 14, as opposed to 20. So this includes crossing the tracks in most locations, unless you're crossing at a designated place to do so. And so chapter 14 is talking about offenses against public safety under criminal law. So NCDOT's Be Rail Safe initiative stresses that the only safe and legal place to cross railroad tracks is at a public crossing designated with either a rail crossing sign, flashing red lights, or a gate. So that website and program from NCDOT, it's aimed at educating both children and adults about the dangers of being on and around railroad tracks. So if this is a problem for your community, make sure you check out the details at berailsafe.org. And again, think about rail crossings in context, right? Often people are walking along or across a track because other safe and efficient options for them to get from point A to point B don't exist. So this problem, if you have this problem, it could actually indicate gaps for connectivity or access within your pedestrian network. And, they're just trying to solve it a different way that's unfortunately not very safe. So that is something to think about, again, getting to that underlying root of the problem. Okay, it is almost 11 o'clock. So we're going to pick back up by looking at the laws that are in place to protect people on bicycles. So we're going to start with the legal definition of a bicycle in North Carolina. What is a bicycle? Per the definition, a bicycle is a non-motorized vehicle with 2 or 3 wheels tandem, a steering handle, 1 or 2 saddle seats, and pedals by which the vehicle is propelled. So there's many different types of vehicles that can fall into that class of bicycles. And North Carolina also has a definition for electric assist bicycles, or e-bikes, which is shown here. And the key thing to remember about this is fully operable pedals for human propulsion. So an electric assist bicycle has pedals, as opposed to being powered by a throttle, like a low-powered moped. So these images here, these are all versions of a bicycle. These are bicycles. And these are both examples of an electric assist bicycle. You might be able to see, particularly in the one that's not the trike, you can see this extra kind of trapezoidal looking box that's on the down tube, and that's basically where the battery is being held. So there may be some clues that you can look at to try to determine, is it an e-bike or a regular bike? So now that we know what a bicycle is, it's important to know how they're classified by law. So per the general statute definition of a vehicle, a bicycle and electric assist bicycles shall be deemed vehicles. So that means people that are riding bicycles are subject to the laws that are applicable to operating a vehicle unless otherwise specified. So the key is to note whether the law pertains to a motor vehicle or a vehicle when you're reading the general statutes in Chapter 20. If the law pertains to a vehicle, then a person operating a bicycle must also obey that law. A lot of people have opinions on where bicyclists should be allowed to ride. And you might have opinions on this. So let's look at what the law says. So section B, upon all highways, any vehicle proceeding at less than the legal maximum speed limit shall be driven in the right-hand lane then available for through traffic, or as close as practicable to the right-hand curb or edge of the highway, except when overtaking and passing another vehicle proceeding in the same direction or when preparing for a left turn. So because a bicycle is classified as a vehicle in North Carolina, people that are riding bicycles must ride on the right side of the road in the same direction as traffic and as far to the right as is safe and practicable. So that word practicable in this statute can cause confusion, right? There's many situations in which it might not be practicable, which means, possible or feasible. And in fact, the end of subdivision B gives an explicit example of one of those situations. So if the person bicycling needs to make a left turn, doing so from the farthest right side of the road is dangerous. So that's a clear example where, you don't want to be as far to the right. So here's some other reasons that people on bicycles might not ride in the right lane or the right side of the lane. So starting at the top left, we can see that this person is avoiding construction barrels that are in the lane. The top right, you see that this woman's lane position is because she's turning left, right? She's in a left turn lane. And she takes the middle of the lane because she doesn't want a motorist to try to creep up next to her and crowd her when turning. This lane position basically forces the next driver to stay in a queue behind her. In the bottom right, or sorry, the bottom left, let's start there. Note that this woman is avoiding a pothole. The road hazards like potholes or gravel or even debris that we as drivers of motor vehicles, we might not even really notice that they're there if it's just debris on the side of the road. But a lot of that can actually cause bicyclists to lose control and crash. So that may be a reason that a bicyclist is not all the way to the right side of the road. And at the bottom right shows up a cyclist that's moving towards, the left to avoid being too close to the parked cars. This is a safer lane position because you want to avoid someone who might be opening their car door and unexpectedly slamming into them. And we call this dooring, right? And there's no law specifically against dooring, but clearly it's a dangerous thing. So bottom line is the law does not require people to ride bicycles to the extreme right-hand side of the road or in the shoulder at all times. It's when it's practicable. So just keep that in mind. All right, to emphasize this point, the North Carolina DMV Driver's Handbook says, it reminds drivers that a person on a bicycle may use the full lane when necessary. So sometimes cyclists ride in a lane position to avoid a road hazard, but often skilled cyclists will ride more in the center or even just left of center to prevent a motorist from trying to pass them within the lane. And this is a defensive riding maneuver It's often deployed around curves or hill crests to discourage drivers from attempting an unsafe path that might squeeze that bicyclist or force them off the road. So as you can see in this image here, there's no shoulder on this road. It's just a ditch on the side. And the lane is not wide enough for a motor vehicle and a bicyclist to be safely adjacent to one another within the same lane should a motorist attempt to pass. So remember back to that General Statute 20-150 that was talking about the limitations of overtaking and passing, and that motorists should only do so when they can do it safely. And when passing bicyclists specifically, they should either completely change lanes to do it, or at a minimum provide that 4 feet of space between their vehicle and the bicyclist. So the bicyclist kind of taking the lane or having a more center lane position is essentially, reinforcing to the driver that they need to move over to pass safely. So here's another topic that comes up often and may not be well understood by law enforcement officers and certainly probably not the general public. Many think that bicyclists should not be allowed to take the lane because they will be impeding traffic. So we look at that with General Statute 20-141H, and that's where we can scrutinize that law regarding slower speed movements. And what it says is no person shall operate a motor vehicle on the highway at such a slow speed as to impede the normal and reasonable movement of traffic, except when reduced speed is necessary for safe operation or in compliance with the law. Provided this provision shall not apply to farm tractors and other motor vehicles operating at reasonable speeds for the type and nature of such vehicles. So note first that this law specifically targets motor vehicles, not the broader definition of vehicle, which would then apply to people bicycling. But even then, if we were to maybe presume that it did somehow, hypothetically, apply, when we look at that logical extension of 141 that's talking about, people operating a bicycle if we think about them operating at reasonable speeds, right? I mean, they're not impeding traffic because it's much like how farm tractors are excluded due to the nature of that vehicle, right? So it's basically saying it is a slower moving vehicle. It cannot go, as fast as a car, as fast as a motor vehicle. And so therefore, just because a bicyclist is slow, it does not mean that it is impeding traffic. So in summary, bicyclists cannot impede traffic just by taking the lane. All right, so what about this one when we consider where people should or can ride? Do you think people should be allowed to bicycle on a sidewalk? Well, there's no state law in North Carolina that prohibits people from bicycling on a sidewalk. However, many local jurisdictions have ordinances that might prohibit sidewalk cycling in certain locations, like maybe downtowns or central business districts. Some university campuses might also have restrictions on where people can bicycle. But we also need to think about that context, right? Going back to that bigger picture. So often children or people who are not experienced or comfortable bicycling in the road, those are going to be where they use the sidewalk. And this might be especially true along roads with higher speeds or heavier traffic, and where there's no dedicated bicycle facility, right? Because that's where they feel safe. So again, think about the context, think about why a bicyclist might be behaving the way they are, and think about if there's another solution to that problem that may not be enforcement. All right, only General Statute 20-173 comments on people riding bicycles on sidewalks, and it's, which requires drivers to look for pedestrians and bicyclists riding on the sidewalk when they're pulling out of or into a driveway, alley, or other such access roads. So we talked about that when we were looking at the pedestrian laws earlier, and drivers interacting with pedestrians. But I just want to point out that person riding a bicycle is kind of snuck in there. So that somewhat presumes that in certain cases, bicyclists might be able to ride on a sidewalk. All right, just like the operators for any vehicle, a person riding a bicycle must always signal their intent in movement before starting, stopping, or turning. And as of 2016, the law in North Carolina was modified, so it does allow bicyclists to use their right or their left hand to signal a right turn. So this image is showing those signals for a bicyclist. You know, looking, if we pretend that we're the driver coming up behind the bicyclist, you can see the left turn, the bicyclist sticks the left arm straight out. A right turn, you can either stick your left arm up or you can stick your right arm out. And then coming to a stop, you stick your left arm down. All right, so it's good to know this, because if you see a person bicycling with their arm extended, you know, don't assume that they're reaching out to give a high five, or they're waving at you or pointing for something to you look at. You know, they're giving you a signal of their intent for movement. Now let's talk about the laws related to the equipment that's needed to operate a bicycle. So there's 3 pertinent laws around equipment. First, we're going to talk about helmets. In North Carolina, only those under the age of 16 are required to wear a bike helmet per General Statute 20-171.9. And this applies when riding in any public right-of-way, regardless of whether it's on the road, a sidewalk, or even a shared use path or greenway. So if you're in a park, you're still supposed to be wearing your helmet. Here, I'll note that the NCDOT has a yearly bicycle helmet grant initiative, and communities can apply for funding to receive helmets to provide children, you know, who may not be able to have one or afford one. It allows them to give those away. So providing a child who is not compliant with this law with a helmet and ensuring that it's of good fit and it's fastened securely, that's likely a more positive and impactful interaction with them than issuing a citation to their parent or caregiver. Another law that North Carolina has that addresses child passenger safety for bicycles is General Statute 20-171.9b. And the key phrase here is in subsection 3, and it indicates that all child passengers under 40 pounds or 40 inches must be seated in and secured in a child seat or bicycle trailer. So again, we don't normally talk about children as passengers on bicyclists or being pulled in trailers, but there is a law about that, and that they need to be securely restrained. Okay, in 2016, the statute about vehicles, lights on bicycles was updated to strengthen and clarify the conspicuity of bicyclists from the rear at night. So bicycles are now required to have a reflex mirror on the rear, and either a red light that's visible from at least 300 feet back, or the operator must wear clothing or a vest that's visible from at least 300 feet back. So you know, 300 feet is about a football distance, football field's distance away. So just kind of think about that as your relevant distance. So at night, the bicycle must also have a front lamp that's visible from at least 300 feet in front of the bicycle. So while the law does not require headlamps or rear lamps to be lighted at all times, like is required for a motorcycle, I have noticed that people riding bicycles seem to be doing this more often. And you might also notice that sometimes their lamps are set to flashing or stutter kind of patterns. The law is silent on this for bicycles, and many cyclists perceive that drivers will be more likely to notice the blinking lights and pay attention, but that's not a requirement. Watch For Me law enforcement agency partners do receive bicycle light sets after they've gone through the after they've met their eligibility with training. And so that can be another positive way to reinforce by giving bicyclists who don't have lights, giving them the lights and actually putting them on their bicycles in lieu of a citation or a warning. All right, let's shift gears and talk now about enforcement practices. So at its root, the purpose of law enforcement is to maintain public order and public safety. Laws help define and maintain the social contract in which people can interact with one another based on agreed upon rules, standards, and protections. So the role of enforcement can be broad and range from prevention of violations to detecting and investigating crimes, to apprehending and detaining people who violate the law. So as many in the public health realm say, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. And often focusing on prevention is more cost effective. So in the context of pedestrian and bicyclist safety, conducting activities that focus on preventing violations, improving voluntary compliance with the laws, and reinforcing behaviors that support that norm and culture of safety that is inclusive of people who walk or bicycle, that may be more effective in reducing the number and severity of crashes. So for this reason, in this next part, we're going to go over the role of enforcement in education, communication, detection, and deterrence. It's also important to note that people's behaviors when traveling within the public right-of-way are strongly influenced by their environment. So land use around them, the roadway characteristics, the existence or not of facilities for them to use, observing the behavior of peers that are traveling, that all these things give visual and contextual cues for how to navigate that space. So often improvements in voluntary compliance with the laws is going to call for a change in the roadway design to provide what's known as self-enforcing roads. So this will likely mean getting to know your engineers and your public works folks, engaging with the planning department, and advocating for those longer-term interventions to create the environments that supports the behaviors of bicyclists, pedestrians, and motorists that are called for through the law. So I do encourage you to attend Module 4, where we're going to dive deeper into the infrastructure and road design to be familiar with. So in large part, the Watch from ENC program encourages a focus on educating and engaging the public to raise awareness of the laws. Past partners reported many positive outcomes from participating in the program, including positive community response to enforcement efforts, perceived changes in sentiment toward traffic safety and quality of life, and improvements in infrastructure forged from those critical relationships that have been established between officers seeing unsafe conditions and engineers that are working to solve those problems. So education is important for everyone because it ensures that common understanding of expectations, and it can help build skills through practice to form those good habits. So this is true for drivers as well as people walking or bicycling. Starting education on how to safely travel in public spaces at an early age is especially useful in fostering lifelong compliance with the laws and a shared perspective of and respect for other people using the road. So, leading with education can also be used as a tool to reinforce the laws, and it provides an opportunity for a positive interaction between officers and people in the community, which can help enhance that sense of community itself. We often think of children when we think of educating on bicycle and pedestrian safety, but education should target many different audiences and be tailored to their needs. Often, the only time adults receive formal traffic safety education is when they go through driver's ed programs, or if they get their license suspended or revoked and they're required to participate in some sort of driver improvement clinic. But the laws are not static, right? I just pointed out a few times that things changed in 2016. So, as laws change or are added to or removed over time as society's values change or as clarification of language is needed, this is why it's important that we stay abreast on what the laws are and consider ways to help improve the public's knowledge of the laws too. The Watch for Me NC program also offers a variety of educational and safety training materials that help officers communicate with the community at large to convey clear messaging and build a normative culture around safety. So this slide shows an example of some of the media ads that NCDOT has funded previously, as well as an example of Durham's PACE car program. Some of you may similarly have other local programs related to Watch for Me that can complement it or serve as a foundation for that Watch for Me that Watch for Me can build off of. So Keith earlier from the city of Charlotte mentioned Vision Zero. That's another type of a program that certainly integrates very well with Watch for Me. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Vision Zero, the concept there is that no severe injuries or fatalities are acceptable on our roadways, and that we should be able to provide a traffic system, a transportation system where no one dies because they make a mistake or are distracted or what have you, that there's some forgiveness that's built into the system. Doesn't mean that we get rid of all crashes. It just means we should be able to get rid of all fatal crashes. So that's the goal for Vision Zero. So this year, the Highway Safety Research Center is working on a packet of materials that will go to the Watch for Me communities. And it includes posters, rack cards, banners, the bike light sets that I mentioned earlier, and reflective bracelets or armbands. And they go to the law enforcement partner that's in those Watch for Me communities who meet the eligibility criteria by going through these trainings. The Highway Safety Research Center also aids partners in outreach efforts by supplying sample press releases and strategies to earn free media through access to training and communications toolkits. So I mentioned earlier that we've got the Module 6 training coming up. If you have a public information officer that you work with, please encourage that person to attend that module. It focuses specifically on communications, and all of you are also welcome to attend. Forming outreach opportunities around key walking and cycling events like Walk to School Day or Bike to School Day, Halloween, Back to School, all of these are great ways to market both an event and the safety messaging. And officers can participate in these events in a variety of ways. Other examples of events where Watch for Me materials might be distributed or where agencies might communicate about, bicycle pedestrian safety include new employee orientations, National Night Out, school events like an orientation night or some sort of student assembly, a bicycle safety clinic, mentioned Halloween, so Halloween themed events or festivals. Really any of these events can create opportunities for those positive interactions with the community while getting key messages across. Speaking at meetings can also be useful as a strategy, and participating in different civic groups is another way to stay informed on what issues or concerns the public has while showing support for traffic safety. Several cities now have a citizen advisory group or some other sort of like public involvement process for residents to get involved in addressing these issues. And they can also support Watch for Me educational aims through what they do. So we've heard about Vision Zero task force like Charlotte has, and I know several other communities in North Carolina have that. Many local jurisdictions have pedestrian and bicycle advisory or advocacy committees, or they may just have, transportation planning or project public meetings, and those can all be avenues for outreach to occur. There are many opportunities for officers, along with other Watch for Me partner agencies, to interact with communities as educators. So one formal program that North Carolina has is the Let's Go NC program, and it's a pedestrian and bicycle safety skills course that is for, it's grade-based curriculum, and it includes lesson plans, videos, worksheets, skill building activities, and an instructor's guide. So it's basically an all-in-one package or kit that can help officers or really anyone else in your community teach kindergartners through fifth graders on how to walk and bicycle safely near traffic. And so it's really skills based, and that's kind of what makes it different from bike rodeos that you might have heard of. The driver education courses are another opportunity for getting involved, maybe as a guest speaker or lecturer, focusing on emphasizing that the privilege and responsibilities that drivers have when operating a vehicle, and how to do so safely around people walking or bicycling. So my understanding is that the driver's ed curriculum is pretty thin on specific instruction relevant to bike and ped safety, but that the instructors have a lot of latitude for how much time they can spend on particular topic areas. So if that's something that you want to bolster and support, consider reaching out to those driver's ed teachers and see if you can be like a guest lecturer to come in and focus specifically on that. Bike rodeos are excellent events for law enforcement officers to be involved in, and they're good at raising awareness. And a lot of our Watch For Me partners do make bike rodeos an annual event. And the reason that they're popular is because they're good at attracting interest and raising that initial awareness. But I want to make sure that people know that these one-time type events cannot take the place of a multi-day skills-based program like the Let's Go and See program is, that provides built-in practice time, more practice time, which is ultimately what people new to bicycling need in order to build safe habits. So just like we do with driving, where people are required to drive a certain number of hours with their learner's permit before they can get their license, there's a lot of research that basically shows for any sort of physical activity like that, the more you practice it, the better you are at it, the safer you will be, the more likely those skills become habits. And so that's really what we want to work towards with teaching bicycle safety skills. All right, so we just highlighted how enforcement can play a role through education and communication. Now let's turn towards considerations for detection and deterrence. So for community coalition partner agencies, it's important to understand what enforcement practices and operations are recommended under the Watch For Me and See program and how those might play a role in your overall approach, so that collaboration between all community partners can take place. Before deterrence tactics can be successfully applied, you need to know what your problem is and where it's occurring. So crash data will be covered much more in depth in Module 5, but these data can be useful in helping give some context to key behaviors, situations, and areas that contribute to bicyclist or pedestrian crashes in your community. But we know that pedestrian and bicyclist crash data is often underrepresenting the actual numbers of crashes due to unreported crashes or crashes that may not even involve a motor vehicle. So, you need to look at other data that you might have access to get a more complete picture. Resident complaint records are a good source to see if speeding or yielding or another behavior is perceived as causing dangerous conditions. And where people feel unsafe. Hospital injury data can also supplement the crash data to better understand severity or to learn about unreported crashes. When available, qualitative data sources from various public engagement efforts can also provide some key insights. So for example, if your community put together a bicycle or pedestrian plan, there may have been outreach that took place during that process that material may be informative. Think about other ways you can help your Watch For Me coalition to identify and investigate the issues around pedestrian and bicyclist safety. And don't forget that iceberg, right? That, we need to think about what other systemic structures of society might be skewing those patterns that you see and the different sources of data that you review. All right, once you have a better understanding of the issues impacting the safety of people walking and bicycling, then conducting a high visibility enforcement operation might be an effective tool for deterrence. So this may be used to target speeding or driver yielding or other key behaviors that have been identified for a targeted enforcement effort. Today, I'm going to focus on pedestrian crosswalk operations specifically, which primarily target driver yielding behavior. So the purpose of a pedestrian crosswalk operation at its heart is still fundamentally an educational tool that when you do it well, it not only identifies and stops the violators, but it also amplifies to the broader public that your community values pedestrian safety and reinforces that, you know, this is the expected norm. You know, we want drivers to yield to people in crosswalks. So a well-planned operation will lead to the public's better understanding and compliance of the laws. There's 6 main steps to take when a law enforcement agency implements a crosswalk enforcement operation. First, identify the high-risk locations, observe the problem and identify the types of violations. You need to calculate the stopping distance. You need to select the type of pedestrian that you're going to use, alert the media, and target the violators. So let's walk through these. All right, first step, choose a location. Again, go back to that data. Have there been crashes or complaints regarding a certain crosswalk? Is there an ongoing problem there? Is it a location known for heavy pedestrian traffic? Or, you know, maybe, for example, it's around a school or located on a busy road. Alternatively, agencies may choose to conduct an operation at a location where a new type of traffic control device or crossing has been installed. So like this example on the image here, this is a pedestrian hybrid beacon. And so that might be, you know, an example where maybe you're opening a new shared use path that crosses a road and you have some sort of new beacon or signal that's installed there. Conducting operations here can ensure that the people who are using that new facility are doing so correctly, and also serve as an opportunity to educate the public on how a particular traffic control device works. But, you know, having a high crash or high pedestrian use location alone isn't enough. So there's certain roadway characteristics and the environment that also needs to be considered for if it'll be suitable for conducting an operation. So especially for agencies that are new to these operations, we recommend that they pick lower speed 2-lane roads where possible. You know, check other factors about the crosswalk location that might impact whether a driver can see and yield to a pedestrian. So, for example, you want to avoid locations where horizontal or vertical curves are going to limit the sight distance. And, you know, police departments might even want to go over candidate sites with their engineering department to make sure there aren't any other design issues at that location, you know, that would impact how people are behaving. We also recommend picking a location or a time at a location with this like Goldilocks amount of traffic. So, you know, not so constant a flow that there are not natural gap opportunities to cross, but also not too few vehicles where you have to wait long periods between drivers approaching. And law enforcement agencies also need to consider, you know, those nearby staging areas where officers can safely pull over violators before they're safely released back into traffic. So that's, you got to think about that larger context. All right, so here's an example in Durham. And you'll note that most of my examples in here are from Durham. That's because I live in Durham, so I personally have a relationship and understand these locations, but also Sergeant Massengill, who is our resident expert on all things Watch for Me law enforcement, is with the city of Durham. So I'm sure you can think of examples in your community as well. This location is a mid-block crossing on a 2-lane road, and it has on-street parking, you can see. And it's got a low posted speed limit and good sight distance. The on-street parking could allow for places for officers to be parked, And there's also nearby parking lots that could, could offer opportunities for the pullover and release locations. You'll also note that there's a sandwich board that's announcing the enforcement operation, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So step 2 is to observe people traveling through the crosswalk area. Do you see people exhibiting the problem in question? This can help you to validate that you're at an appropriate location where there is a problem. And it's also a good opportunity to identify if there are any issues with the location that might make it unsuccessful for an operation. So here's another example in Durham, and it's near a school. Actually, my daughter goes there. And it is a problem area. It's a 2-lane road, one way with parking on one side, and 35-mile-per-hour speed limit. It's heavily used by pedestrians who are crossing to and from to get to school, but then also, other times of day, because it's basically a downtown location. But you can see from the image on the left that there's a slight, uphill curvature in the road. And with the parked cars and the tree-lined nature of the street, it means that drivers that are about 140 feet away, you really don't have a clear view of that crosswalk, or even the pedestrians who might be waiting to cross because of the trees. So while it seemed like a great place for an operation because it's got a lot of pedestrians who cross there, and it's got a lot of drivers who don't yield to pedestrians who cross there, it wasn't necessarily the best place for an operation because of some of the built environment aspects at that location. Okay, sorry, my slide was not going forward. All right, so once you settle on a crosswalk location, you need to mark out the buffer zone or the dilemma zone. For a 30-mile-per-hour posted road, this equates to about that 140-foot distance I mentioned earlier in the last picture. That's back from the crosswalk to account for that distance that it would take a driver to react and brake if they're going at a certain speed to yield to the officer that's acting as a pedestrian wanting to cross. So after you mark that distance, the officer only attempts to induce a yield from the driver before they've entered that buffer zone. If a driver's already entered the buffer zone, we're basically saying they're driving too fast and are too close for them to safely yield at that point. Agencies need a minimum of 2 officers, but ideally you want probably around 4 to 6 officers. For some jurisdictions, you could use a mascot, like is shown with this Donald Duck on the left, and that could be effective for ensuring broad media coverage, which amplifies that safety message you want to convey. Most often is to use plainclothes officers to serve as the pedestrian. However, in some communities, you'll also find that drivers won't even yield to an officer in a uniform. So you can do it either way. Getting the media to cover an event before, during, and after an operation is really going to boost the number of people that become aware of the law, right? And really the goal is that education. It's to make sure people know what the law is and that they're behaving appropriately, and that they know how to comply, and it's building in that values set in the community. So before conducting an operation, you need to alert the public via the media, via community social media outlets, things like that. Be direct in telling the public when and where the operations will take place. It's not about ticketing. It's about getting drivers to yield to the people in the crossing. During the operation, officers might interact with many drivers who didn't yield, and many more drivers who see the operation taking place will also be impacted by what they observe. But working with the media to cover the operation is going to reach that much broader audience. So you want to be prepared with talking points about why these kinds of operations are important, why pedestrian safety matters, and how else your community might be addressing pedestrian and bicyclist safety through the Watch for Me program. So here's an example on the left of a social media message that Garner NC used prior to an operation in Garner. And it may be hard to read. It says, we will be conducting a crosswalk enforcement / educational campaign throughout various areas in the town of Garner today from 2 to 4 p.m. So again, pretty simple, but it gets the word out. It might pique people's interest about what does that mean, and start that conversation. Once the groundwork is laid and the media is notified, it's time for the law enforcement agency to conduct the operation. So some agencies are going to use an officer with plainclothes to serve as a spotter, to work with the pedestrian officer to help call the sighting officer that's waiting downstream, which vehicles did not yield. The sighting officer should be prepared with information, brochures, warning booklets, any kind of educational materials, and they need to be able to explain to the drivers which laws they violated. Officers can also have discretion to issue citations for more egregious violations, like if there's excessive speeding or, passing a vehicle that is yielding to a pedestrian. Remember, we talked about that multi-threat crash, or, if there's aggressive driving that might endanger the pedestrian, like if they pass too close or swerve or something like that. So it's important, we're going back to, the officer understands crossing consistently, and it's based on that language that your legal team has determined, what the definition of within is for the pedestrian in the crosswalk. The law enforcement agencies need to have, have their operations plans shared with judicial officials and prosecutors, so that, if you do give any citations, they're going to be upheld and withstand that judicial scrutiny. So just keep people abreast of what you're doing. We've got about 10 minutes left. I am going to skip showing this video, but we will provide it in a link to everybody so that you're able to watch it on your own time. It's a really good video that shows how a plainclothes officer is conducting the operations with his team. He's always well on the street, on the blacktop, so there's no ambiguity when he's attempting to cross. And you can probably notice other elements when you watch this video, of their operations like that we just discussed. So think about that when you're watching it. Think about how your agency might be able to run a similar type of operation in your community. And okay, so while the setup and crosswalk operation we just went through is the most common one, there are a few other enforcement operations that an agency might consider. So for example, enforcement, a signalized intersection, you can focus on yielding behaviors of turning drivers where people turn right on red, and they might not yield to people that are crossing in front of them, or left turning drivers at a permissive green that might not yield to pedestrians that also have the walk. These are obviously a little bit more complex types of operations to carry out. On the flip side, if a pedestrian compliance is your issue, is your problematic or leading to dangerous conditions, then you might target the people who are crossing against the signal or the don't walk. That's also an option. And for these types of operations targeting pedestrians, the officers might be on foot. Watch For Me partner agencies can also set up operations to provide equipment to people on bicycles, like I mentioned. So distributing the helmets to children who are observed riding without one, or securing bike lights on the bikes of people riding under dark conditions. Finally, here's an enforcement operation that kind of stands everything on its head. Instead of targeting violators, you are actually targeting the people who are following the law. And this is another positive reinforcement activity that rewards and encourages good behavior. Again, to be most effective, you want to involve the media to get coverage of this as a way to broaden your reach. So these caught being good operations, they also work best when you coordinate with a local business partner to sponsor the reward. So it might be something like a gift certificate for coffee or ice cream or some other kind of small treat that the local business can sponsor. After any high visibility enforcement operation, remember to follow up with the media and share the results. These deterrent strategies are most effective when more people know about it beyond the individuals that the officers interacted directly with during the operation. So, Watch for Me partners, remember that you're also required to report your enforcement operations as part of the Governor's Highway Safety Program grant requirements through HSRC. So we have this reporting form for you guys that are Watch for Me communities to report your operations, as well as any educational event or speaking engagement that you're doing, that an officer conducts or the partner agency conducts. So this is where you can indicate the number of print or safety materials that you distribute through an event or an operation, and that helps HSRC when we're tracking and reporting the summary needs back to the Governor's Highway Safety Program. And the form is set up so that you submit one form per event or engagement or operation. For law enforcement agencies that are a part of the Watch for Me community, the efforts can also be reported to GHSP through their STEP web portal. So you gain access to that system after the officers have completed the training required for eligibility. And once it's accessible, officers can report on the operations events, but also educational events like speaking at a driver education session or teaching a traffic safety course like through a bike rodeo, and even media events like holding a press conference about Watch for Me and your community's local plans, that can also be eligible. Okay, so let's take a few minutes with the time that we have left. If you guys have any additional questions, maybe we'll take a couple minutes for that. And I'm going to go up to the,
yep. We had one question submitted in the chat box while you were reviewing the enforcement, and Drew asked, does Watch for Me also promote enforcement operations directed towards pedestrians and bicyclists, not just motor vehicle drivers?
Right. So we do talk about all the different ones, and that's why it's really driven by the local community as far as what their needs are, what their issues are, what their problems are that they're prioritizing. So we focus a lot on motor vehicles because, remember I talked earlier about the shared responsibility, and a larger proportion of that responsibility does fall on motorists because they're driving the heavier vehicle that's going to do more damage if they break a law. But that said, if you have perpetual issues with pedestrians that are violating laws or bicyclists that are violating laws, you can do enforcement operations that are directed towards those particular behaviors. And it really just depends on the community and what their particular issues or needs are. But yeah, good question. I see that Ellen also had a question about the ad labels on the gas pump handles or the gas pump toppers. That was a media buy that NCDOT did a few years ago. I don't know what they're going to do this year. We haven't heard yet, but they tend to change things up on an annual basis. And I can't remember if they did any gas toppers last year, but I don't think they've done them in a while. So it's possible. But yes, as you mentioned, those ads can be pretty expensive, even the static ones. And that's really up to NCDOT. They make those decisions about the media buys for that. Maybe one more question, if anybody wants to come off mute. Okay, so pedestrians can cross anywhere mid-block as long as they are yielding to the vehicles, right? Remember we talked about that. They have to yield, but they can cross mid-block. All right, number 2, this one is false. The key here is the at all times. Remember that there are many reasons why a bicyclist riding as far to the right as practicable may not be as far right all the times. So that's why this is false. Number 3 is true. Motorists must yield when turning, even when making that right turn on red, they need to yield. And number 4 is also true. Drivers can cross the center line to pass a person bicycling even in a no passing zone if there's enough room and distance to do so safely. And number 5, this one is false. Remember that triple threat scenario or multiple threat scenario that we talked about? If one car is stopped for the person in the crosswalk, then that second car cannot go around and pass that car. They need to stop as well. Okay, so those are the answers. I want to remind you about the upcoming workshops that you can also find on our website to register for. When we have the recording of this session available, it will also be there at the website. So please feel free to share the recordings or the registration information with others that you think might be interested in this material. Thank you so much for attending the workshop today, and we hope to see you at the next training. If you do have any other questions and you want to talk to us, reach us offline, feel free to contact us. We're always willing and able to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks, everybody.